Hey everyone, I'm going to teach you how you can get every logical transition question right on the digital SAT. The logical transition questions are actually easy to spot. The question's always going to be, which choice completes the text with the most logical transition? You see that, you know you're dealing with a logical transition question. So what are these logical transition questions? So these logical transition questions are asking for a relationship between two sentences. And what you have to do is you have to read the first sentence, understand the first sentence, read the second sentence without the transition, just read the second sentence, understand the second sentence, and then ask yourself, what is the relationship between the two sentences? Do it before actually looking at the answer choices, because that's just going to throw you off. So read the first sentence, understand the first sentence, read the second sentence, understand the second sentence, and ask yourself, what's the relationship? So there could be different relationships. One of them could be an example, which is an example of what is stated in the previous sentence. Some transition words for that would be, for example, for instance. Another one could be continuation, which is additional information to be added to the previous sentence. Some transition words that you're going to see are also, additionally, furthermore. Another transition would be a change or contrasting. So, for example, it would be contrasting the previous sentence. So some transition words would be while, however, although. So the next would be conclusion, which is as a consequence to the previous sentence. So as a consequence to the previous sentence, this occurs. So some transition words would be as a result, finally, therefore, consequently. And so once you do that, you'll be able to pick the right transition words. All right, as usual, we're going to go through a couple examples, and we're only going to use examples from the real thing, right? We want to practice from the real thing, so when we take the real thing, it's going to be no different than practice. So let's go and let's look at question number 29. We see here the question is, which choice completes the text with the most logical transition? So we know it's a transition question. So let's try and do exactly what we discussed. You'll read the first sentence, you'll understand the first sentence, you'll read the second sentence, you'll understand the second sentence, and then let's see what the relationship is. Although novels and poems are considered distinct literary forms, many authors have created hybrid works that incorporate elements of both. So what is it saying? So although novels and poems are considered distinct literary forms, so you think of them as two different things, many authors have created hybrid works that combine both elements. Okay, let's look at the next sentence. Bernardine E., the Emperor Babe, is a verse novel, a book-length narrative complete with characters and a plot, but conveyed in short, crisp lines of poetry rather than prose. So they're saying that Bernardine's Emperor's Babe is a novel, and there's characters, but it's conveyed in short, crisp lines of poetry rather than prose. So it's a novel and poetry sort of combined into one. So what's the relationship between the two sentences? It's actually giving an example of what is stated in the previous sentence. Right? The previous sentence is saying that although novels and poems are considered distinct literary forms, many people have created hybrid works, and the next sentence gives an example of that. So I would say sort of example. So that's the answer, D, right? For example. By contrast would be a contrasting piece of information. Consequently would be as a consequence. And secondly would be, if there would be a firstly, then you'd have a secondly. All right, let's move on to another example. Let's look at question number 30. We know it's a transition question because we see it here. So let's read the first sentence. At 2 weeks old, the time their critical socialization period begins, wolves can smell but cannot yet see or hear. Okay, so at 2 weeks old, wolves can smell but can't see or hear. Okay, got it. Domesticated dogs can see, hear, and smell by the end of 2 weeks. This relative lack of sensory input may help explain why wolves behave so differently around humans than dogs do. From a very young age, wolves are more wary and less exploratory. So what's the relationship between the two sentences? The first sentence says at 2 weeks old, wolves can smell but can't see or hear. The next sentence is saying domesticated dogs can see, hear, and smell. So it's actually contrasting the previous sentence. And we're looking for something that's contrasting. Well, actually, we see the answer right here by contrast. But let's look at the other answer choices. In other words, would be saying the same thing, in other words. For instance is an example, and accordingly is as a consequence of the previous sentence. All right, let's move on to another example. We can sort of go all day. Let's look at 28. Small flat structures called spatula are found at the tips of the hairs on a spider's leg. Okay, so you find these things on the tips of a hair of a spider's leg. These spatula temporarily bond with the atoms of whatever they touch. And these spatula temporarily bond with the atoms of whatever they touch. Okay, that's the first sentence. Spiders are able to cling to and climb almost any surface. So the second sentence is spiders can cling to and climb almost any surface. So what's the relationship? Well, because they bond, because as a consequence of the previous sentence, this occurs. So that would be as a consequence, right? As a result. As a result of the previous sentence, because they bond, then they can cling and climb on any surface. So I would say as a result. For instance is an example, however, is contrasting the previous sentence. And similarly is, in a similar case, additional information to be added to the previous sentence. All right, let's move on. You can see how this can actually be easy to do if you follow the structure that I'm explaining to you. Let's look at 29. In November 1934, Amrita Gill was living in what must have seemed like the ideal city for a young artist, Paris. She was studying firsthand the color-saturated style of France's modernist masters and beginning to make a name for herself as a painter. So they're saying that she was living in the ideal city for an artist, which is Paris. She was studying firsthand all the colors and all the stuff that you need to do to be a great painter. Cher Gill longed to return to her childhood home of India. Only there, she believed, her art truly flourish. So now they're saying she longed to return to her childhood home of India. Well, the first sentence is saying how she's actually in the ideal location of an artist, and this next sentence is saying she wanted to go back to India where her art can flourish. So it's sort of contrasting the previous sentence, right? The previous sentence is saying she's an ideal city of Paris for art, and here it's saying she longs to go home in order to finish her art. So it would be contrasting. So the answer would be, now let's look to see what can be contrasting, would be still. Still, she longed to return home to her childhood home of India. Only there she believed her art could truly flourish. Therefore, would be a cause and effect. Indeed would be sort of a additional information, and furthermore would be furthermore would also be additional information. So they both can't be right, and therefore would be as a consequence of the previous sentence. All right, let's do a next one. Number 30. Before California's 1911 election to approve a proposition granting women the right to vote, activists across the state sold tea to promote the cause of suffrage. Okay, so before women got to vote, activists sold tea to promote the cause of suffrage. In San Francisco, the Women's Suffrage Party sold equality tea at local fairs. So in San Francisco, the Women's Suffrage Party sold equality tea at local fairs. In Los Angeles, activist Nancy Craig, who ran one of California's largest grocery firms, distributed votes for women tea. So the first sentence is, in San Francisco, the Women's Suffrage Party sold equality tea. Then the next sentence is, in Los Angeles, they also did something. So it would be additional information similar to the previous sentence. So it would be similarly, because in San Francisco they did something, and then in Los Angeles they did something similar. So it would be similar. Similarly, for example, would be an example of what's stated in the previous sentence, and it's not an example of what's stated in the previous sentence. To conclude is not a conclusion. In other words, would be this saying the same thing in other words. So similarly would be the answer. Hopefully that made sense to you, and now you're able to dominate these types of questions on the digital SAT when you see them. Just keep practicing and you're going to get the hang of it. Don't forget, please like and subscribe, and I really do appreciate all of your support.